Josh adjusted the lens on his camera, his hands trembling with a mix of anticipation and nerves. "All right, Dave, this is it. Beyond the Veil investigation's first real case." Dave smirked, leaning back in his chair and twirling a pen. "First case, first potential disaster. You sure we're not biting off more than we can chew?" Josh rolled his eyes. "A haunted mansion that supposedly leads to another dimension? What's not to love? The internet will eat this up. We need to start somewhere. And this legend is perfect." The legend of the mansion had taken the online paranormal world by storm. It was an estate nestled deep in the woods, its exact location a whispered secret among locals. The stories spoke of explorers who entered, never to return, or of people emerging days later, raving about impossible hallways and doors that led to worlds not meant for human eyes. Some called it a portal, others a trap. No one called it safe. Josh leaned over his laptop, scrolling through blurry photos and grainy videos taken by alleged survivors. One video froze on the image of a towering mahogany door. "They say this is the threshold. Once you step through, the house decides if it lets you go." Dave chuckled. A house with a god complex. Lovely. Despite his sarcasm, Dave felt the same pull as Josh. Something about the mansion was irresistible. The danger, the mystery. It was the kind of story that could make their fledgling channel explode. They spent hours preparing. Cameras, flashlights, EMF detectors, and enough batteries to power a small city were crammed into their bags. Josh insisted on bringing a notebook, a habit from his investigative journalism days. "In case the tech fails," he explained. By the time they loaded their gear into Dave's van, the sun was dipping below the horizon. The mansion's location was pinned on a map app, but the last leg of the journey required directions scribbled in a forum post by someone claiming to have been there. "You're sure about this?" Dave asked, turning the key in the ignition. Josh nodded. "Think about it. If this legend is even half true, we'll have footage no one else has. People are drawn to the unknown. This could be our breakthrough." The drive was uneventful at first, the hum of the engine filling the silence. As they veered onto a dirt road, the forest seemed to swallow them whole. Trees leaned over the path like watchful sentinels, their skeletal branches scratching at the van. "This feels like the setup to every bad horror movie," Dave muttered. Josh didn't respond. His eyes were glued to the GPS, which began to glitch, the dot flickering in and out. "We're close," he murmured. The mansion appeared like a specter, emerging from the dense forest as they rounded a bend. It stood tall and defiant, its windows dark, its facade worn yet imposing. A chill settled over them as they parked. "Well," Dave said, his voice tight, "welcome to the beginning of the end." Josh grabbed his camera, heart pounding. "Let's see what's waiting for us inside." The mansion loomed over them, its silhouette jagged against the darkening sky. Moonlight spilled through the clouds, illuminating details that made Josh's stomach twist. The windows were empty, yawning voids of blackness. The door, thick and splintered, looked as though it could swallow them whole. Ivy snaked up the sides of the stone walls, clinging like skeletal fingers. Dave exhaled sharply. "Creepy as hell. It's like the house knows we're here." "Perfect for the cameras, though," Josh replied, hoisting the equipment bag onto his shoulder. His attempt at levity fell flat. Even he could feel the oppressive weight of the air. It wasn't just the cold that made him shiver. It was something deeper, a sense that the mansion was alive and watching. The crunch of their boots on the gravel path was the only sound as they approached the door. Josh pulled out his camera and hit record, narrating as he went. "Beyond the Veil Investigations, Case 1. We've arrived at the mansion, rumored to be a gateway to another dimension. Locals refuse to go near it, but tonight we're going in." Dave shook his head. "You sound like one of those ghost-hunting TV hacks." "Better to sound like one than end up as one," Josh shot back, testing the door. It groaned loudly, the sound echoing in the stillness. He gave it a push and it swung open, revealing a dimly lit entryway. They stepped inside, the air immediately cooler than outside. Josh swept his flashlight across the room. Dust floated lazily in the beam, and the smell of mildew was overpowering. The grand foyer was strangely pristine despite its age. A massive chandelier hung overhead, its crystals dull and coated in grime. The staircase at the far end was wide and elegant, its banister carved with intricate designs of vines and flowers. "This place is weirdly intact," Dave said, his voice hushed. "Shouldn't it be falling apart by now?" Josh didn't answer. His eyes were drawn to the walls, lined with faded wallpaper in a pattern that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at it. The effect made his head ache. He turned the camera toward a doorway on the left. "Let's check this out." The room beyond was a parlor, its furniture draped in sheets. A grand piano stood in one corner, the lid open as if waiting to be played. Dave pulled back one of the sheets, revealing a claw-footed chair with upholstery that looked brand new. "Josh," he said, his voice tinged with unease, "this stuff isn't rotting. It's like someone still lives here." Josh's flashlight caught movement in the corner of his eye. He whipped it toward the source, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows cast by their gear. "Did you see that?" he asked. "See what?" Dave replied, already pulling out the EMF detector. "Thought I saw." Josh trailed off, shaking his head. "Never mind." They set up their cameras, placing one in the foyer and another facing the staircase. As Dave adjusted the angle of the second camera, a low creak echoed from above them. Josh froze. "Did you hear that?" Dave turned slowly, his face pale. "Yeah, that wasn't us." Their eyes met, and for the first time Josh saw real fear in Dave's expression. "Let's just keep going," Josh said, his voice steadier than he felt. They stepped toward the staircase, unaware that the door behind them had silently swung shut. The staircase creaked beneath their boots as they climbed, each step groaning like the house itself was protesting their intrusion. The chandelier above swayed gently, though there wasn't a hint of wind. Josh kept the camera rolling, his flashlight beam flickering across peeling wallpaper and tarnished sconces. "This place is incredible," he whispered, more to himself than to Dave. "It's like it's frozen in time." Dave snorted quietly. If time froze in the middle of a fever dream. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched longer than it had appeared from below. Doors lined both sides, their brass knobs dull and smudged. Josh approached the nearest one and hesitated. The air here was different, thicker, heavier, like walking through syrup. His pulse quickened as he reached for the handle. "What do you think is behind it?" Dave asked, breaking the silence. "No idea," Josh replied, gripping the handle and twisting. The door opened with a low groan, revealing a dimly lit room filled with bookshelves. Dust coated the volumes, and cobwebs stretched across the corners of the ceiling. "It's a library," Josh said, stepping inside. His voice echoed faintly, as though the room was larger than it seemed. He moved his flashlight across the spines of the books, noting their worn titles. Histories of the Unseen, Through the Rift, and The Shape of Fear. The titles sent a chill down his spine. Dave followed, glancing nervously at the shadows pooling in the corners. "I don't like this. Feels like something's waiting." Josh ignored him, too focused on a large book lying open on a table in the center of the room. The pages were covered in hand-drawn diagrams of circles, lines, and strange symbols. As he flipped through, the illustrations grew more disturbing. Figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, standing in landscapes that defied logic. "Hey, check this out," he said, holding the book up to Dave. But Dave wasn't looking at him. His flashlight was fixed on the doorway they had entered through, now standing closed. "Josh," he said, his voice tight, "did you shut the door?" Josh turned, his stomach lurching. "No, I didn't." They both stared at the door for a long moment. Then Josh moved toward it, camera still rolling. He reached out and twisted the knob. It opened easily, but what lay beyond wasn't the hallway. Instead, the door revealed another staircase, this one spiraling downward into darkness. That's not where we came from," Dave stammered. "Josh, that's not where we came from." Josh's mind raced. He swung the camera around to capture the scene, then turned back to the room. It was no longer a library. The bookshelves were gone, replaced by walls that seemed to stretch and breathe. The table and book had vanished, leaving only the two of them in a suffocating, empty space. "What the hell is going on?" Josh whispered. Before Dave could answer, the door slammed shut on its own, plunging them into darkness. A faint hum vibrated through the air, and Josh's flashlight flickered wildly. The floor beneath them shifted. What had been solid wood now felt uneven, almost spongy. "We need to get out of here," Josh said, his voice trembling. He reached for the door again, but it wouldn't budge. Behind them the air seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising off pavement. A soft groan, almost human, echoed through the room. Both men froze. And then, without warning, the door flew open, revealing a hallway that neither of them recognized. Josh and Dave stepped cautiously into the new hallway, their flashlights barely piercing the darkness. The air felt wrong here, thicker, colder, as if the walls themselves were alive and pressing in. The sound of their breathing seemed amplified, echoing faintly in a space that defied logic. "This isn't the same hallway," Dave said, his voice a strained whisper. "Where are we?" Josh didn't answer. His flashlight beam caught another door at the end of the hall, different from the others they had seen. It was taller, made of black wood that gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. Intricate carvings adorned its surface, symbols that made Josh's stomach churn the longer he stared at them. "Should we open it?" Dave asked, though he was already inching backward. "We have to," Josh replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "We need to document everything. Whatever's going on here, people need to see it." He raised the camera and moved forward, gripping the strange door's handle. The metal was ice cold, and a jolt of static tingled through his hand as he turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a blinding violet light that forced them both to shield their eyes. When the light dimmed, they saw it. A vast alien landscape stretched out before them. The ground was a deep, shimmering black, reflecting the violet sky above like a mirror. Jagged rock formations jutted out at impossible angles, and strange, spindly plants swayed despite the lack of wind. "What the hell is this?" Dave muttered, stepping forward despite himself. Josh followed, his camera whirring softly as it captured the impossible scene. The air here felt electric, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl. In the distance, something moved, a shape too far away to make out but large enough to send a surge of panic through him. "Do you hear that?" Dave asked suddenly, his voice barely audible. Josh strained his ears. At first he heard nothing, then faintly a low droning sound reached them, like a distant guttural chant. It grew louder as they stood there, the vibrations pulsing through the ground beneath their feet. "We need to go," Dave said, his voice rising. "Now!" Josh didn't argue. They turned back to the door, but the sight before them made them both freeze. The door was no longer there. In its place was a jagged rock wall, smooth and featureless. "No, no, no," Josh muttered, spinning around. The violet sky seemed darker now, the shapes in the distance moving closer. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, reaching toward them like fingers. "This way," Dave shouted, grabbing Josh's arm and pulling him toward a narrow path winding through the rocks. The droning sound grew louder, filling their heads with an unbearable pressure. Josh stumbled, his camera slipping from his grip and clattering onto the ground. "Leave it," Dave yelled. Josh hesitated for a fraction of a second before abandoning the camera. They ran, the jagged rocks slicing at their boots. The shadows closed in, the droning morphing into something almost like a voice, alien and incomprehensible, yet somehow beckoning. Ahead, another door appeared, this one glowing faintly. Dave reached it first, throwing it open with desperate force. Josh followed, and as soon as they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them. They were back in the mansion, sprawled on the floor of the hallway. The oppressive air of the alien world was gone, replaced by the suffocating silence of the house. Josh's chest heaved as he looked up at Dave. "What the hell was that?" Dave shook his head, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "I don't know, but I think this house is playing with us." Josh and Dave sat in the hallway, their breaths ragged, and their minds racing to process what they had just experienced. The walls around them felt closer than before, the flickering light of their flashlights casting warped shadows that seemed to dance on their own. "This isn't just a haunted house," Josh said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's something else. It's alive." Dave stared at him, his eyes wide. "If we're not careful, it's going to kill us." They both stood, their movements cautious, as if the floor itself might betray them. The hallway stretched ahead, impossibly long, with doors on either side. Josh felt his stomach churn. The layout had changed again. The way back was gone. "We need to keep moving," he said, gripping his flashlight tighter. We'll find another way out." As they walked, the mansion seemed to hum with an almost imperceptible energy, its oppressive silence broken by faint groans and creaks. They passed doors that radiated unease, doors with no handles, doors that pulsed as if something alive was trapped behind them. Josh resisted the urge to open one, his instincts screaming that it would be a mistake. Then a sound stopped them both, a voice, faint and familiar. "Dave?" Dave froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The voice came again, soft and pleading. "Dave, it's me, Mom." Josh turned to his partner, whose face had gone pale. "It's not real," Josh said quickly. "You know it's not real." Dave shook his head, his eyes glistening. "Josh, I know how this sounds, but that's her voice. I'd recognize it anywhere." "It's the house," Josh said firmly, grabbing Dave's shoulder. "It's messing with your head." Before Josh could stop him, Dave broke free and sprinted toward a door at the end of the hall, where the voice had come from. Josh followed, his heart hammering. "Dave, wait!" Dave threw the door open, revealing a dimly lit room. Inside, a figure sat on an old wooden chair, cloaked in shadow. As Dave stepped closer, the figure became clearer. A woman, her face gaunt but unmistakable. "Mom?" Dave choked out, tears streaming down his face. The figure's head tilted slightly, and a grotesque smile spread across her face. "Come closer, sweetheart." Josh grabbed Dave's arm and yanked him back just as the figure's form began to shift, its limbs elongating unnaturally. The woman's face melted into a featureless mass, and her voice turned guttural. "Stay. Stay forever." The room erupted in a piercing wail, and the door slammed shut behind them, throwing them back into the hallway. Dave collapsed to his knees, shaking. "I told you it wasn't real," Josh said, his own voice trembling. Dave nodded, his breathing ragged. It felt so real. As they pressed on, Josh began to feel the mansion's influence seeping into his own thoughts. He saw fleeting visions of wealth and recognition, his wildest dreams seemingly within reach. One door in particular caught his attention. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack he saw stacks of money and awards, with his name etched on them. "You've always wanted this," a voice whispered in his mind. "Just step inside." Josh shook his head violently and stumbled away from the door. He realized then that the mansion was playing a deeper game, weaving their desires and fears into traps meant to ensnare them forever. "Dave," he said, his voice firm, "this place is in our heads. Whatever we see, whatever we hear, we can't trust any of it." Dave nodded weakly, still shaken. "Then how do we fight it?" Josh didn't have an answer. The only certainty was that the mansion was far from done with them. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, its warped angles and flickering shadows bending their sense of reality. Josh and Dave moved cautiously, their flashlights barely cutting through the dense gloom. Every step felt like it brought them deeper into the mansion's clutches. "Do you hear that?" Dave asked, his voice barely audible. Josh paused, straining to listen. There was no sound, no creaking floors, no faint hum. Just an oppressive, suffocating silence. It was worse than noise. "Let's just keep moving," Josh said, trying to sound confident. He wasn't sure how much more of this they could take. They turned a corner and stopped dead in their tracks. The hallway ahead was lined with picture frames, dozens of them hanging in perfect symmetry. The frames were ornate, their gilded edges glinting faintly in the flashlight beams. "What is this?" Dave asked, stepping closer. His voice trembled. "Why are there pictures here?" Josh felt a chill crawl up his spine. The photos in the frames were crisp, detailed, too modern to belong in this ancient mansion. He peered at one and felt his stomach drop. The photo showed a man standing in a room filled with shelves of old books. The man was Josh. "That's me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dave moved to the next frame. His hand flew to his mouth as he gasped, "Josh, this one's me." The photo showed Dave sitting at a table, his head in his hands, as if he were in deep despair. The room behind him was unfamiliar, filled with furniture that didn't match anything they'd seen so far. Josh's hands trembled as he shone his flashlight down the hallway, inspecting the other frames. Each photo was of them, caught in moments they had no memory of. In one, Josh was lying face down on a staircase, blood pooling beneath him. In another, Dave was standing in the foyer, staring at the front door with an expression of sheer terror. "This doesn't make sense," Josh muttered, his heart pounding. These, these can't be real. Dave's flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, Josh thought he saw movement in one of the photos. He stepped closer to a frame, his breath hitching as he studied the image. His own reflection in the photo stared back at him, except it blinked. "Josh!" Dave shouted, yanking him back. "Did you see that? It moved." Josh nodded, his mouth dry. "This isn't just a haunted house. It's showing us something, taunting us." They moved further down the hallway, but the photos grew more disturbing. One showed a door they hadn't yet opened, with a dark figure standing behind it, its face obscured. Another depicted the mansion's foyer, but it was filled with shadowy humanoid shapes, their hollow eyes staring directly at the camera. As they reached the end of the hallway, they came to the largest frame of all. This one showed the two of them standing exactly where they were, in the same hallway, staring at the same photo. But there was a third figure behind them, tall, skeletal, and cloaked in shadow. Josh whirled around, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Nothing was there. "We need to get out of this hallway," he said, his voice tight. "Now." Dave didn't argue. They broke into a run, the flashlight beams bobbing wildly as they fled. The photos seemed to shift as they passed, the figures in them turning to watch their escape. They reached a new door at the end of the hallway and slammed through it, stumbling into another room. As the door creaked shut behind them, the silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Josh leaned against the wall, his heart racing. "This place, it's alive," Dave said, his voice shaking. "And it's watching us." Josh nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "We have to keep going. It's the only way out." But deep down, he wondered if the mansion would ever truly let them leave. The room they stumbled into was impossibly large, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into darkness. Dim light came from flickering lanterns that lined the walls, casting erratic shadows across the floor. In the center of the room stood a single wooden table, its surface empty except for a tarnished mirror. Dave hesitated, gripping Josh's arm. "This feels wrong. We shouldn't be here." Josh felt it too, a sense of foreboding that settled deep in his chest. But there was no turning back. The door they had come through was gone. "We don't have a choice," he muttered. "Let's see what this place wants." They approached the table cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The mirror was oval-shaped, its silver frame intricately carved with symbols Josh couldn't decipher. He glanced at his reflection and froze. The image staring back wasn't him. The version of himself in the mirror looked wrong. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. Dried blood streaked his temple and his lips were cracked and pale. The reflection smirked, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a chill down Josh's spine. "It's not real," Josh whispered, tearing his gaze away. Dave wasn't looking at the mirror. His eyes were fixed on something beyond it, something Josh couldn't see. "Do you hear that?" Dave asked, his voice trembling. Josh shook his head. "There's nothing to hear. It's the house messing with you again." "No," Dave insisted. "It's real. Listen." Josh strained his ears, but the room was silent. He was about to argue when Dave bolted, sprinting toward the far end of the room. "Dave!" Josh shouted, running after him. The lanterns flickered wildly as Dave reached a door that hadn't been there a moment ago. He threw it open and disappeared inside. Josh hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stop, but he couldn't leave Dave behind. He stepped through the doorway into a space that shouldn't exist. The room was small and claustrophobic, the walls lined with mirrors. Each one reflected a different version of Josh and Dave. Some were grotesque. Josh saw himself covered in burns, his skin blistered and peeling. In another, Dave was grinning maniacally, blood dripping from his hands. "Josh," Dave whispered, his voice trembling, I can't do this." Josh turned to find his friend huddled in a corner, his knees pulled to his chest. "Dave, we need to keep moving. This isn't real. It's just the house trying to scare us." Dave looked up, tears streaming down his face. "It's not just scaring us, it's breaking us." Josh knelt beside him, gripping his shoulder. "We're stronger than this. Whatever it throws at us, we'll get through it. Together." A sudden noise made them both jump, a deep, resonant thud like a giant heartbeat. The mirrors around them began to shimmer, the reflections rippling as if they were made of water. The sound grew louder, each thud reverberating through their chests. The mirrors began to distort, the images of themselves shifting and writhing. One by one, the reflections turned to face them directly, their hollow eyes boring into their souls. "We need to go," Josh said, pulling Dave to his feet. "Now." They ran toward another door that appeared in the far wall, the sound of the heartbeat growing deafening. The mirrors seemed to shatter as they passed, the shards vanishing into the darkness. They burst through the door and found themselves back in a hallway. The heartbeat stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. Dave leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. "Josh, this place, it's inside our heads. It knows everything about us." Josh nodded, gripping his flashlight tightly. "That's why we can't let it win. If we give in to fear, we're done." But deep down, he wondered how much longer they could resist. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead of them, dimly lit by flickering sconces that cast jagged shadows on the walls. Josh and Dave moved quickly, their breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The hallway narrowed to a single door, ornate and glowing faintly. Its surface shimmered, the carvings writhing as though alive. Josh hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. "It's another trap," Dave said, his voice trembling. Josh shook his head, steeling himself. "It's our only way out." He pushed the door open and the pounding stopped. The sudden silence was oppressive, as if the mansion itself were holding its breath. Beyond the doorway was a vast circular room, the walls covered in cracked mirrors that distorted their reflections into grotesque caricatures. In the center of the room stood a single object, a tall, ornate mirror, its surface dark and rippling like liquid. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy that made Josh's skin crawl. "This has to be the center of it all," he said, stepping forward cautiously. Dave grabbed his arm. "Josh, look." Josh followed his gaze to the mirrors lining the walls. Their reflections weren't mimicking their movements. Instead, they were watching, faces turned slightly, eyes following their every step. One of the reflections grinned, a wide, unnatural smile that sent a chill down Josh's spine. "This place wants to break us," Josh muttered. "We can't let it." The tall mirror in the center began to ripple, its surface distorting as something moved within it. Josh stepped closer, raising his flashlight. The light didn't reflect back. Instead, the mirror absorbed it, growing darker with each passing second. "Don't go near it," Dave warned, backing away. But it was too late. The mirror's surface exploded outward and a figure stepped through. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its face smooth and featureless except for a gaping mouth that stretched impossibly wide. It moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like a marionette controlled by an unseen hand. Josh and Dave stumbled back, the creature advancing on them with inhuman speed. "Run!" Josh shouted. But the room shifted again, the walls closing in, trapping them with the thing. The reflections in the mirrors began to change, showing scenes of their worst fears. Josh saw himself lying lifeless in a pool of blood, while Dave's reflection screamed silently, clawing at his own face. The images burned into their minds, threatening to overwhelm them. The creature lunged, its movements faster than they could comprehend. Josh grabbed a shard of glass from one of the cracked mirrors, slashing at the thing as it closed in. The shard connected, and the creature shrieked, a sound that rattled the very foundations of the mansion. The mirrors around the room shattered, and the air filled with swirling glass and light. Josh grabbed Dave's arm, dragging him toward a new doorway that had appeared in the chaos. "This is our chance," he shouted. They bolted through the door, the creature's wails echoing behind them. The mansion seemed to collapse around them, the walls twisting and folding in on themselves. Every step felt like a fight against gravity as the floor tilted wildly. Ahead, they saw the foyer, the first familiar sight since they'd entered. The front door stood open, moonlight spilling inside. "We're almost there," Josh yelled. They sprinted toward the exit, the mansion's fury chasing them. Just as they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them with a thunderous finality. Josh and Dave collapsed onto the overgrown lawn outside the mansion, gasping for air. The night was eerily quiet, the oppressive weight of the house gone. The moon hung low in the sky, bathing the forest in a cold, pale glow. Josh turned back toward the mansion, half expecting it to vanish or shift into something unrecognizable. Instead, it stood silently, its dark windows staring back at him like empty eye sockets. Did we actually make it out?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Dave nodded, clutching his knees as he tried to steady his breathing. I don't know how, but yeah, we're out. Josh reached for the camera strapped to his chest. Miraculously, it was still intact, though he doubted it had captured anything useful. The memory cards were likely corrupted. Just another cruel joke from the house. We need to check the footage, he said, more to himself than to Dave. They sat in the van a few minutes later, unwilling to linger near the mansion any longer. Josh plugged the camera into his laptop, his hands shaking. The screen lit up, but the files were a mess, glitching and skipping, the images distorted beyond recognition. Every so often a clear frame would appear, the distorted mirrors, the infinite hallways, the monstrous figure. It's enough, Josh said, his voice resolute. It's proof that something's there. Dave leaned back in his seat, staring blankly out the window. Proof of what? That we're insane? That we almost got killed in a house that shouldn't exist? Josh met his gaze, his expression firm. Proof that we were right to start this. People need to know what's out there. If this is what we found on our first case, imagine what else is waiting. Dave didn't respond immediately. He stared out at the mansion, now just a dark silhouette against the trees. Finally, he said, We barely made it out alive. What happens next time? Josh's lips curved into a grim smile. We'll be ready. They drove back to their office in silence, the weight of their experience settling over them like a heavy fog. By the time they arrived, dawn was breaking, casting a warm glow over the town. It felt surreal, as though they'd been gone for days rather than hours. Josh uploaded their story online, pairing the corrupted footage with their detailed account of the night. The response was immediate. Comments flooded in, ranging from skepticism to awe. Some praised their bravery, while others accused them of fabricating the entire thing. It didn't matter. For Josh and Dave, this was just the beginning. The mansion had tested them, pushed them to their limits, but it hadn't broken them. As they packed their equipment for their next investigation, Josh glanced at Dave. You still in? Dave hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I'm in. But let's hope the next place doesn't try to eat us alive. Josh chuckled, though there was little humor in it. No promises. They loaded their gear into the van, the lingering fear replaced by a burning determination. Beyond the Veil, Investigations wasn't just a name anymore. It was a mission. The mansion might have let them go, but it wasn't a victory. The scars it left would stay with them, reminders of what lay beyond the veil. And for Josh and Dave, the veil was only just beginning to lift. Hey guys, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.